fellow travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. How, my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. And remember to click that subscribe button, everybody. We have an amazing show for you because boarding the mothership is John Gray. He is the creator of The Ghost Whisperer. We discuss the show's creation and his new novel, The Desecrated. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Gray. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
It's totally my pleasure, sir. Big fan of yours.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you. So I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for writing and who were your earliest influences?
Well, I really, what inspired my love for writing, I think, was growing up in Brooklyn and, feeling like I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to affect people emotionally the way I was affected when I went to the movies or saw something on television I liked. And so I wanted to emulate that. I really liked that. And it was a way to sort of stave off loneliness, to a certain degree. I just loved it. I just always, and I started writing stories, fiction before I ever got into movie making, which was the arc of my whole career. But at first it was just me and a little notepad. And, it's funny, like many writers, I think, we're talking about, I came of age like in the 70s. That's how old I am. And, I had this marble notebook and I had a rolling writer pen. And like buying a new pen would be enough to inspire me to write a new story, just to be able to watch the ink flow on that paper. Really loved it.
And that's awesome. I think I've very much had the same feeling. Usually for me, it was definitely like I'd buy like a notepad and be like, okay, I'm going to do some work today. This is going to happen. Right. Didn't always work, but usually, at least for the hour or whatever getting home, I'd be thinking to myself, I got the pen, I got the notebook, it's happening today. So you're perhaps best known for creating the series The Ghost Whisperer. Yeah. What inspired you to create the series, and which aspect of paranormal fascinated you most?
Well, I've always been interested in paranormal. I've always been interested in the idea of what happens after we die, if anything. I love horror. I love like gothic horror. So there was an opportunity here to meld all those things. And I had done a lot of work for CBS, had a really good relationship with them. And so they introduced me to this woman, Marianne, who the show is kind of based on, who had the ability to see the dead before they crossed over, or more accurately, because they were stuck here. They were earthbound and they could not cross over. And she could help them cross over. And so when I met with her, I was so struck by her because she was this completely normal, nice, Midwestern, salt of the earth woman. It wasn't all what I expected, some ethereal person, speaking riddles. And so I thought, wow, this is such a great character. So maybe there's something to do here where I can meld that emotional drama that I love and also gothic horror on the show. And that's kind of what really got me excited about it.
Well, I think the great thing about Ghost Whisperer is that you have, there's obviously a thread going along with Melinda and her story, but it's also a lot of weekly stories about the ghosts that are tied into everything. Now you're balancing both dramas, hers and basically the story of that week. Is that a difficult balance to maintain? Did you ever feel like either one character, either Melinda or the weekly story was going to get lost?
Oddly enough, it was a more difficult show than one would think to write, and it actually it defeated a long line of writers who came and went, because ultimately we wanted the show to be a horror show. We wanted to have this emotional thing, but it was also a mystery. There had to be this twists and turns, and we wanted a certain level of humor in each episode. So it's a lot to pack in, and to pack in well. So it was difficult. It was a really difficult, show to find those balances.
And I think another part of the show that was very interesting is it's very much an idea or a philosophy of death itself, or of the afterlife itself. And according to your philosophy, at least from the view of the series, is that the ghost itself, or the entity, is the thing that holds us back. It's not being punished by God or something along those lines. It's the individual refusing to leave, or in many ways, sometimes even punishing itself for
Right.
whatever reason and needs to be helped. So that's a very interesting view of an afterlife.
Well, it's sort of like the idea of closure, of unfinished business. That was a
Hmm.
theme of that show. Yeah, and very many of those characters were afraid to cross over. They had a comfort level being earthbound. They liked being around their loved ones. They liked seeing what was happening to people, and so they didn't want to cross over. And some of them were malevolent. Some of them were angry and bitter, and they wanted to cause trouble. And they wanted that toxic energy to infect the lives of those who were who they left behind. So each character had I think, a really interesting kind of backstory and a reason for being there, and a mystery around their death, and that Melinda had to kind of solve.
So, as the writer, and once again dealing with death in the afterlife, you obviously have a correlation connected to ideas of religion. Was it a tight or hard to walk that line to be careful of be inclusive to other ideas of faith, but at the same time making sure it's still a story of an afterlife, or at least a view of it?
We had a totally agnostic view. We did not touch on religion. It was simply a show about dead people who stuck around,
Hmm.
and this woman who could help them cross over to go to the next place on their journey in the afterlife. We never we didn't touch the ideas about hell or heaven or purgatory. It was just pretty much that simple. The problems that face these people.
And I think one of the cool thing is that not only did you create Whisperer, but you wrote a novel called The Desecrated, which is fantastic. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And it also deals with ideas of death, spirits, clairvoyance, things of that nature. And it was written, I think it's 10 years after Ghost Whisperer or something along those lines.
Yes, Ghost Whisperer went off the air in 2010, so it's 12 years.
12 years. So in those 12 intervening years from Ghost Whisperer to writing this novel, how has your idea of death and the afterlife changed in those intervening years?
I still have a lot of fear about death. I still, one of my biggest fears, because I have friends who believe that there's no afterlife. It's just when you go, it's lights out, and that's it.
Yep.
And that to me is really terrifying. That's it. So I think about it a lot, and I worry about it a lot. There's a great comedian once who said that he wasn't afraid of death. He just didn't want to be there when it happened. That's kind of how I feel.
No, I can totally understand that. That's a good theory to have. Let there be death, but I'm not going to be in it, take any part of it. Yeah, it kind of reminded me of those. I don't know if you ever saw the TV show on Netflix, Sandman.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's a great show on Netflix, based on a wonderful comic by Neil Gaiman. And there's a couple of characters who decide just not to die. They're just like, I think he said it's like a fool's game. Death is a fool's game, so he's not going to take part. So he lives forever. He's immortal now. And I thought that's a great philosophy to have. if you can get away with it, that's the way to go.
If you can afford it,
Right. So when did you decide to write The Desecrated? And if my research is correct, it's your first novel. Is that correct?
it is actually it's my first novel, although it's technically my fourth novel, but it's the first novel that I felt might be good enough to ask people to pay for. The other three novels were practice, and I would never inflict them on anybody.
Until someone finds them in your drawer somewhere years from now.
The instructions are to burn them. So I did, I mean to write, make a serious attempt at a novel. And, obviously, last year in February, well, not last year, 2 years ago now, in 2020, when everything started shutting down, all my projects went on hold. Many just died. And I thought, man, if you don't write a novel now, you never will. Here's this golden opportunity to do it. So that's when I really started doing it, and just every day, just plugged away at it until I had something that I felt good about.
As someone who's written so many scripts for, once again, Ghost Whisperer and a bunch of other projects as well, how hard of a transition was it to move from that to novel writing?
It's a great question because it's a double-edged thing. Because in some ways it's very difficult because if the career in screenwriting, your entire focus and training is on economy.
Mm,
And tell the story visually with as few words as possible, and just get that story to sing in pictures, and in terms of an episode in 42 minutes
mm,
or in 90 minutes for a movie. Um, but with a novel, it was daunting because you had to now provide for the audience visuals, which you're of course you provide them in movies too, but you're shooting stuff in movies. But now I'm not shooting anything. I've got to put pictures in people's heads with words,
mm.
and so that's a different discipline, and a big learning curve. And I ended up just loving it. And it was also very freeing because unlike movie and television writing, you don't have to worry about subplots. And if you want to take a little side trip down an alley to go into some character's backstory, that can be a really funny or scary or
Mm.
interesting complex story that affects the plot, you can do that. You could just kind of go off on this little tangent and then join the plot again. And that's a luxury you don't have. I mean, any TV writer or movie writer knows the heartbreak of having to cut away all the subplots and all the great character stuff and all the things that you love and the
Mm.
audience would love, but there's no time to have them. So that's one of the things I love the most. I want to talk about Urson and his experiences as a grave robber in Turkey, and I could just go off and do that and keep doing it, when it applied to another situation. So it was great. I can't wait to write another one.
Now, from having talked to people who've done written scripts and for TV shows and things of that nature, have not done one myself. There's when someone writes a script for a TV show, there's a writer's room, there's other writers, directors, actors, a lot of people who are constantly looking at what you've written to give feedback and ideas, and you're bouncing things around. When you're writing a novel, it's kind of like a lonely room. It's just you in a vacuum for maybe a year of writing it. The thing hasn't been seen for a while. Is it scary to write something like a novel where, like I said, it's a vacuum where you're not getting that feedback, and anytime the manager know, is this something that's good enough to continue with?
Well, another good question. And actually, before Ghost Whisperer, that was my first and only series as a writer. And so up until that point, I'd spent, I don't know, 20 years more writing and directing movies, either
Mm,
films or movies for television. And so when I came to Ghost Whisperer, I was used to writing alone. I was used to just being in that room by
mm,
myself. And I actually found it a very difficult adjustment to suddenly be in a room with 7 or 8 other really smart people, and suddenly having to bounce ideas. It took a lot of adjustment on my part to get used to that. And
mm.
so in a way, this is sort of like going back to what I really love and what I'm more comfortable with anyway. Just me and the keyboard.
So it was the opposite thing. You actually prefer the solitude of of being a novelist.
Up to a point. I mean, what was great about my movie career is that I could write a script, and then just when I was at the point of being fed up with being alone and being just, then I'd go off and make that movie,
Mm.
and I'd be surrounded by people 24/7 for however many months, and just when I get fed up with that, that's over, and now it's time to go into the cutting room, just myself and the editor. So I always had these kind of stages I could go through.
Mm.
With this novel, there was never that moment of, okay, now I'm going to go off and I'm going to shoot this. I didn't get the social aspect of it, which I'm used to.
Well, I do have a question about that, because looking through your IMDb page, there is a short film that you've done called The Desecrated. It
Yes,
was about 8 minutes long. Is that the same as the novel?
it's a scene from the novel, and the movie itself is actually up on my website, which is johngrayofficial.com. And it was done because we are going to make a movie ultimately out of this novel. And so I've written the script, and this proof of concept little film was made as a sample of what the film
Mm.
could look like and feel like in a bite-sized chunk. So
Now,
that's where that came from.
Now, when you were working on the novel, do you think to yourself, this would be a movie, or did you think to yourself, as after you were writing it, this is really good, maybe I can turn this into a movie? So was it like always a plan to make a movie, or did you just realize this is good, I'm going to try something with
You
this?
know, I just think, honestly, given who I am, and the idea that I've spent my life making movies, it was never far from my mind that I'm gonna shoot this at some point.
Mm.
And we'll have to wrestle with all the difficult things I'll have to throw away that I won't have time for in the 90-minute movie or 2-hour movie. But I try not to dwell on it as I'm writing it. I don't want to start thinking about, oh, this would be a good scene. I just want to be focused on the novel. But behind my left kidney, I know that at some point this is going to be a movie.
Well, there's definitely a lot of moments in the book where I'm thinking to myself, now that you mentioned it as a movie, thinking that's gonna be an expensive thing to shoot right there. That's yeah, like the creature, without giving too much away, the creature itself. I'm thinking to myself, that's not gonna be a cheap movie. You're making that one. So, are you thinking at all when you're writing it? Well, this is gonna be a bit of a high budget thing. I don't know how I should put this in the novel, or do you just go for broke, do the whole
You just
damn
go.
thing?
You just go. I mean, that's something I learned writing movies and TV. Those early drafts, you just write what you want to see and what you think is going to be fun, and
Mm.
then you worry about, can I do it, and it will, or do I have to scale it down? You bring in people like, I have a great visual effects guy named Armin Kevorkian, who's just a genius. He did Ghost Whisperer with me. He does all my short films now. He does everything for me. He's great. And so I can sit down with Armin and say, okay, so this is what I want to do. What do you think? And he'll say, like, yeah, well, here's how we could do that. Or he'll say, well, that's going to be really difficult, but if you try this instead, I mean, so it's like everything else, a good collaboration. But the important thing I would say to any writer is, don't try to edit yourself as you're writing. Just imagine the best possible thing you can imagine, and then you'll figure it out, one way or the other.
Because I'm gonna say there's a really great sequence without giving too much away with the I guess it's the morgue, the van, the creature, the woman, and I think it's Angel, if I remember correctly. That's a hell of a scene. That to be on film would be really impressive.
Yeah, I can't wait to shoot that, I must say. And what's interesting is that this the what inspired me really to write this novel, or just to have this idea about a horror thing, was that in 2015, uh, not many people know this or remember it, but Lindsay Lohan was sentenced to community service at the LA County morgue.
Mm.
And she spent 53 days at the morgue, just doing morgue stuff. And when I read that, I was just blown away by it, because I thought, what that must have been like for the workaday people who work in that morgue. And suddenly there's a movie star amongst them, and a controversial one, no less. So what could that have possibly have been like? And that's what started me get with this idea. And then I kind of reversed it and made it a male movie star, an English heartthrob, and crossing swords sort of with a young woman who's in a troubled place in her life and trying to get her life back on track. And he just comes crashing into her life, and she works the night shift. But that's really where it came from, was this whole idea of a movie star doing community service at a morgue, and you got to love that judge. It's a
I,
great sense of
I
humor.
never heard that before. I did not know that, and 'cause I was thinking about, because the character we're talking about in the book is Trevor, and I thought to myself, what? That's not a thing. And then apparently it's a thing.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That God, I kind of want to interview the judge now as well and be like, the hell? That's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah. And when I was doing research, I actually interviewed the director of the LA County morgue, very nice guy, and he's a little fed up with answering Lindsay Lohan questions, but I did ask him what was it like, and he said that I think the first day she came late, and they just didn't let her in, and that day now does not count. You got to start over again the next day. And then she kind of fell in line, and according to him, did a great job. She was nice to everybody, and it was all good.
That's so they didn't let her in the first thing she was late. That is absolutely hysterical. So you did a lot of research then about morgues and stuff in preparation for this book.
I did. I spoke to people who worked in morgues. I learned all the procedures, what happens, how everything works. I'm fascinated with morgues, and particularly the look of morgues. We did a morgue on Ghost Whisperer, and it was like my dream morgue. We did a real gothic morgue.
Yeah.
And I just loved it. Every time I had to shoot in there. I loved it. It's the ultimate creepy place.
Right. That's awesome. And I think another aspect about the book that's kind of interesting is that you place the events in the present. COVID is a very real thing in this book. So what led to that decision to make COVID that much of a element of the story?
Well, of course, it was on my mind because I was writing it at the height of the pandemic, but I also realized that this is going to pass. So I didn't want to make it during. I didn't want to set it during the pandemic, when things were at their worst. But I also realized that the after effects of COVID are going to be with us probably for a generation, if not
Mm,
more. And I think, like COVID, like the flu, is going to be with us always. And so it just didn't feel realistic to write a current story that didn't mention COVID in any way, shape, or form.
mm.
So I felt like we had to give a nod to it. That in the novel, the pandemic is pretty much over with, but there are still effects people are dealing with. And I also find there are, in my mind anyway, my sick mind, there are certain images that are really scary, like around ventilators. Those things, I think, the imagery of a ventilator is really, really frightening. And so I decided to incorporate some of the things that we've all become familiar with now because of COVID into the horror.
I also wondered if there was a, because I think when I was reading it, and I'm not don't know if I read too much in it, but a commentary on how we were handling death with COVID. Because COVID, like I remember COVID was on TV constantly, death counts, and it sounds like everyone's dying. Everyone's dead, is hundreds of thousands. The hospitals are full, everything else, and your story very much centers around that concept of death as well. Were you making a commentary about how people handle or approach death from COVID in your book?
Well, I'm interested in that idea, regardless of COVID. Just how people cope with death. In the book, Jennifer's, dad has died, her mother has died. How has that affected her? She has friends who die, and of course, in the morgue, everyone in the morgue she meets is dead. So I'm interested in how people process death, and and not necessarily in a grim, depressing way. As you might have seen in the book, I mean, there's a lot of very funny stuff around
Mm.
what happens in the morgue, and there's a lot of black humor. And I tried to infuse the book with a lot of humor, and also with some emotion, which isn't always present in horror. So it was fun to try to do that.
And the cast in the book is pretty huge. You have, for instance, Jennifer Shelby, Ulysses, Trevor Price, Otis, Angel, Clover, I believe. Um,
Don't forget Miss Nadia.
oh, Miss Sandra as well, most certainly. So how do you balance all those characters in a book that actually the book is not that long, about 200 pages long. That's a lot to do in 200 pages.
It's 330 pages.
Okay, oh, maybe because I'm looking at mine on the phone. I read mine on my
Oh,
phone.
I see. Yeah.
But yes, but I mean, how do you balance that many?
Well, it helps having had a lot of experience, writing television and movies, and you're constantly trying to figure out how can I make this character memorable. What can I do with this character that will make the audience? If I don't feel like the audience has to like a character. I think they have to understand the character, and so that's always what I'm trying to go for with a villain or whoever I'm writing. So it just becomes a thing of, and sometimes you're not even planning on a character until you're writing a scene, and suddenly you just realize, oh no, I need someone to come in here and do this now, and then that person appears, and now, oh, I like that person, I think they could be funny, so let me give them a backstory that we can then weave into here. So it's a little bit of like a detective story, as well, when you're trying to investigate who all these people are.
Yeah, that's one thing I liked about the novel as well is that it very much balances like a thriller horror, but it's also a mystery because for quite a bit of the story, you're trying to solve the puzzle what's happening. Jennifer Shelby is trying to solve her own mystery of what's happening with her. Ulysses has something going on. Once again, is how did you balance that? And was there ever a danger of one element running away with the story, becoming too much of a mystery, or getting caught up too much into the horror and not balancing both properly?
I think it's always a danger, and I think it's where my Ghost Whisperer, experience helped me
Hmm.
because we were always balancing that show with humor and mystery and twists and turns and the horror of it all. So after doing that for a long time, there's a certain amount of it that just is sort of second nature. Um, and it's fun. To me, there's nothing more fun than breaking down a story and trying to figure out where the twists are and how you're going to plant seeds and hopefully no one's going to detect at least the first time around. Um, to me, it's a great big fun puzzle. And I have a trusted group of people who read for me, and they'll tell me like, okay, this is you're out of hand here. This is way too far over here. So it's important to have that, even though we don't want to have get network notes anymore. We had enough of those. But it is important to get people you trust who will tell you the truth, and and have the ability to hear it and go back into the material and say, okay, this is not right. I gotta fix this.
I think one of the most interesting characters in the novel, at least in my opinion, is Ulysses. I think he's a very complicated character, a very interesting character, and in many ways, kind of and a very much a tragic character. Where did that idea come from? Because for the listeners who don't know, he lives in the cemetery. Basically, well, not. I mean, he's basically homeless. I mean, I think he lives there, but so where did the concept of him come from?
Well, I needed a someone who could sort of be an entree for Jennifer to the cemetery,
Hmm.
and I wanted someone to sort of be a father figure for her, but also at the same time, someone who's mentally ill and needs her to take care of him as well. So it sort of brings that part of her out, where she's a caretaker to people and she loves people and wants to help people. So there's an interesting thing between the two of them where they have that dual kind of thing. And I also thought I love the idea of a guy on a quest. This guy is going to find his daughter,
Hmm.
and what's the mystery around that? And how much of that is his insanity? How much of it is actually true? And Jennifer's not quite sure. She's never. I mean, she's always trying to help him, but she doesn't really know if there even is a daughter.
Hmm.
So that character just kind of grew and grew, and um, it was a fun. And by the way, we have Stephen Lang attached to play that character in the movie. So
Oh, very cool, very nice.
it's really great.
But when you're ready to film the movie too, you're coming back and talking about that as well. I hope.
You bet, love to.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
yeah,
And I think one great thing about Ulysses, once again, he does mirror Jennifer pretty well in the idea of both dealing with loss, both are questioning their sanity in a very real way. I mean,
right.
Ulysses has to question about his own sanity. I mean, he was again living in a cemetery, but Jennifer throughout the story, there is a question of, is she crazy or does she have an ability? Um, so I think that's a very interesting way of mirroring each other. And
Yeah.
as you're writing it, how did you approach the sense of her very potential mental illness?
Well, it's something that she's frightened about, and she has a history of it in her family because her father, who we see in flashbacks, was this really, really single dad. He was a fun and solid guy, and as he got older, he became a victim of dementia and ultimately got COVID. And Jennifer had to drop out of medical school to take care of him. Um, so it's a caretaker thing that I feel is an important part of her character, not because she's a woman, but because she has this need to nurture people, and I think it comes from her own feeling of having been nurtured by her dad, who had to step up when her mother died and take care of things, and she promised him that. Well, as you remember from the book, when she was having all of her episodes, her psychic episodes, things were exploding in the house, and one of the psychiatrists that her dad takes her to suggests that he institutionalize her. And Jennifer overhears this as like an 11-year-old girl, and her father says to her, "Look, you're not going anywhere. Don't even worry about that." And that's what she brings with her when he finally has his breakdown, and he's not going. She's not going to let him get institutionalized. She's going to take care of him, even if it means a sacrifice that she has to make.
What is the effect on her mentally with having been working? I mean, she works the graveyard shift. which is a very lonely type of job and lonely lifestyle. Because once again, once you're out of work and everything, I mean, everything almost in the world is almost shut down, except for the very few people who are still functioning at that point. How does it impact her to live in a world that's basically a pretty dark, lonely world for her?
Well, when we meet her, it's exactly what she wants. She needs to make money. So she's got this job where it's just her at night and, the dead. She's already studied pre-med. She's what her ambition had been to be a doctor. So she wasn't squeamish or frightened around the dead. It was just a natural part of life for her. So it was a great place for her to kind of regroup, get her head back together again. Now, of course, the interesting question is, had Trevor not come along, how long would Jennifer have stayed in that morgue? Would she have just kind of become part of it and never get out of it? Uh,
Right.
or would she ultimately have gotten herself together and realized, okay, I got to change my life's direction? So when we meet her, she's quite at home there and very comfortable, and hates the fact that she now has to share her night shift with this loud, fun-loving guy.
Mm. How about another interesting character is Marty, the detective. Is that another like did you do some research into that where you already pretty much covered from Ghost Whisperer and how that all functioned? And once again, being a cop, a detective at working, I guess, in the story of the graveyard shift, how did you envision him at first?
Well, Marty is a guy who's also dealing with a certain amount of loss. He's a bit of a lost soul himself, and Marty is kind of a romantic. He's a guy who reads and he's smart, and the fact that he chose a career as a police officer, which is a in many ways a physical, dangerous job, speaks a lot about who he is and where he thinks he's going in his life. Because Marty could have just as easily become a college professor. He had the intellect for it, he had the curiosity for it. But I think, for me, this character being a street cop and ultimately becoming a detective, it feeds his curiosity, because there's no greater classroom for behavior than if you're a cop.
Mm.
And I'm lucky enough to know a lot of cops, and so I was able to combine some people I knew and some imaginary elements as well, and come up with this character who, um, the last thing in the world he wants to believe is anything remotely supernatural, and
Mm.
he's got to really question himself about whether that's something that's going to happen.
And but my wife is in love with Egypt. Everything Egypt, she loves everything Egypt, and the inclusion of the medallion and the Egyptian background is really quite fascinating. So where did that come from?
Well, that was just the research as well, because I was looking for a a mythology that would drive the hauntings and would tie in the cemetery and would tie in the morgue, and so in the course of a lot of research, I came upon this Egyptian god called Anubis, whose job is to protect dead from the living. And I really love that notion. And I thought, what a great, fun thing to have the first part of the novel be that they think that it's actually to protect the living from the dead, this creature, but it's actually to protect the dead from the living. And since part of the novel is also a crime, as we discover, that's tied into the horror, that whole protection thing becomes an element of it as well. And again, Ulysses wants to protect Jennifer, and she wants to protect him. So this amulet kind of changes hands a few times during the course of the story.
I will say I really thought it was a fascinating concept, and I never thought about the idea until you introduced it, protecting the dead from the living. Because once again, you always think about the opposite. But as you mentioned in the book, the idea of the grave robbing, of like the pyramids and that nature, that made more sense. I was like, oh, okay, I can totally get where that's coming from.
Right.
it,
Yeah.
it was very cool.
Good. Great. Yeah. I mean, historically speaking, grave robbing, it's something that goes back, centuries really, and it was very, very prevalent here in New York at the turn of the century, when medical schools were progressing and becoming more people were studying to become doctors, and where do you get cadavers to work on? And they were just kind of under the table, pay these guys to go out there and steal corpses. And everyone kind of winked and turned away from it.
Well, like I said, it's a fantastic novel. I really enjoyed it. Is there a sequel in the works?
Yeah, I do have an idea for a sequel, which involves Marty and Miss Nadja, and of course Jennifer. But there's another novel I'm interested in writing first, so it'll be a little while, I think, before I get to it.
How soon are we looking at a movie then?
I don't know. I mean, we're actively trying to put it together. We're trying to cast it. We're trying to raise money for it. In an ideal world, I would shoot it in the spring. But that's the ideal world. Who knows?
Well, like I said, I really thought it was fantastic. And Mr. Gray, it was a total pleasure to talk with you, sir. And The Desecrated is a.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, you too.